Good evening or good day, wherever you may be from a chilly Hobart. I wanted to begin by saying from myself and colleagues here in Australia that we are indeed very sorry we aren't hosting this SCAR meeting as intended right now. For myself, I missed the chance to see my SCAR friends and colleagues in person. Nevertheless, I'm really thrilled and impressed that we've been able to see something emerge from these times and have this SCAR online meeting. Since this early session does come from Hobart, I want to extend to you all our warm wishes for you and your families for safety and well-being. And I will open this as I would have if you'd been here in Hobart. And that is by acknowledging the original custodians of the land from which I convene this meeting, the Muanina people of Lutruwita or Tasmania, in this location of Nipaluna, Hobart. The session today is going to be a very exciting session. We will see presentations on behalf of the scientific research programs. The SRPs are the flagship project structures that SCAR uses to deliver its scientific research. And in this session today, I'm confident that we'll be inspired to hear some of the achievements of the 6 SRPs that are presenting today. Throughout this presentation and session, I'd encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we can then address those with perhaps a burning question after each talk, but then a good discussion session at the end. The first of our presentations today is going to come from the SRP called AntEco, or the State of the Antarctic Ecosystem. This will be presented by Dr. Hugh Griffith. Hugh is a marine biologist with 20 years experience and has led this research in a very impressive and coherent way that's drawn this all together. The State of the Antarctic Ecosystem research aims to increase the scientific knowledge of biodiversity from genes to ecosystems that can be used for the conservation and management of Antarctic ecosystems. AntEco was designed to focus on past and present patterns of biodiversity across all environments within the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean, so that we might understand the future of this changing region. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Hugh for his presentation. Thank you, Hugh.
Good morning, or should I say good afternoon, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. Hopefully you can see my presentation now. And first, I'd like to start by saying it's not just me. I'd like to say this represents a lot of people's work, including my co-chair, who sadly can't be with us today, Jan Strugnell, but I know she's thinking of us. And yeah, State of the Antarctic Ecosystem, AntEco. And as well as covering everything from genes to ecosystems, it covers everything from microbes to whales. So we're talking about huge scales, the whole of the Southern Ocean or the whole of the Antarctic continent, and also along with that, huge time scales, so the evolution of this unique environment. And we do that through 3 really big overarching research questions. So how was Antarctic biodiversity evolved in response to past environmental change? And what does this tell us about its capacity to respond to future changes? So what can we learn from the past that will help us inform the future? What are the systematic and environmental geographic features of Antarctic biodiversity? And what are the mechanisms that underpin the current distribution and abundance of biodiversity? So what is driving hotspots in the Southern Ocean or the endemic species that we find on the continent, and where does our current state of knowledge leave us in understanding those processes? And then moving on to, given the evolved geographic distribution of diversity and the forecast of threats, what conservation actions are required for the preservation of biodiversity and mitigation of and adaptation to change? So it's not just knowing where we are now and where we've come from, but what can this knowledge do to help us understand all of the human impacts that are going on in Antarctica today? And to answer those 3 big questions, we really had to split ourselves up into 5 interconnected work packages. And those included spatial ecology, so where things live and why they live there; molecular ecology and evolution, so kind of our way of understanding into the past and seeing what's related to what and how it's connecting to the outside world; eco-informatics and systems biology, which, to be honest, I'm not an expert to explain to you, but it's very complex and involves everything from microbial connections through to the largest environments, and paleoecology. So our understanding of past environments, which has been highlighted by our first speaker today in terms of ice cores and things like that, we're looking at the biological elements and the environmental factors that would have affected those biology, right back to the time of the dinosaurs through to present day, and impacts, trends, and conservation. So that really is about human aspects within Antarctica. So where we're putting our research stations, how fishing and climate change and ocean acidification and tourism and other things are impacting the life that we are studying, and what we can do to do it better in terms of conservation. And none of this would be possible without the human element. And this is our leadership team. So we have a committee that represents 6 continents. So we're doing pretty well in terms of global representation. And we've been going since 2013, when Don Cowan was our leader and Alex Terode was his deputy. And then in 2014, Alex Terode stood in to take over that role. And then eventually, when he went on to do other roles within SCAR, Jan Struggle and myself, who you can see pictured here, took over the leadership, and we're ably assisted by Don and Pete Convey as our deputies. But I would love to have the time to tell you all about these other amazing people who've helped us with our real journey on this program. But mention Julian, who's coming up soon, who is our contact within Antira, the other biological program within SCAR. And of course, we have 325 members of our mailing list who are essentially our main body of scientists who are contributing to the program. And the science they contribute is amazing. We've got it covering such a wide range of topics, scales, different animal groups. We're looking at huge things like climate change, where we're looking at it here in the terrestrial realm. We have it in the marine, and right down to microbes and how they're responding, and the amount of carbon that's being produced by organisms within a moss bank. Another big and global issue such as plastic pollution, and we're working with the Plastic Action Group to look at things like where the biggest impacts of plastics, including microplastics and macroplastics, are within the Antarctic. And we managed to identify that there are levels comparable with parts of the west coast of the United States within the Antarctic ecosystem in terms of numbers of microplastic particles, which was shocking. Also looking at how we got to the diversity we have now. So we have looking at what the impacts of food availability and sea ice and other things are on biodiversity. Also on land, where you have geothermal outcrops helping organisms survive through glacial periods. Then we have right down to microbial diversity, which is really poorly understood in the Antarctic, and the microbes that are associated with other organisms as well, not just the ones that are free in the environment. And we do cross-disciplinary research with other SCAR programs, including AntClim 21 and Antira. Another thing that we look at is carbon within the environment, and blue carbon, and more specifically benthic carbon. So when organisms grow and die on the seafloor, they'll trap carbon in their bodies, but that is all dependent on the environment that they're in. So there are positive feedbacks from environmental change, where warmer water with less sea ice may produce more benthic organisms, but the changes you get from things like ocean acidification may reduce the ability of the environment to store that carbon. There's huge international projects on predator tracking, which have brought together global data sets of Southern Ocean species to create for the first time a real understanding of which areas and regions are important for feeding and nesting and other life cycle things for the birds and seals and whales of the region. And biology is even able to inform ice sheet modeling. So understanding the evolutionary rates of organisms and using their genes, you can actually help to understand when the last time 2 populations of animals were connected. And if that required there to be open water between those two species, it meant that you couldn't have an ice sheet in the way at the time. So biology doesn't just learn from our physical sciences partners, but also informs them as well with a timestamp for when events must have happened. And unusually for a SRP, a scientific research program, we were lucky enough to have a fieldwork expedition hosted by the British Antarctic Survey on the RRS James Clark Ross. We were able to take 22 scientists, 50% of which were women, representing 9 different countries and 16 research institutes. And a third of our researchers were early career researchers, down to the South Orkney Islands to investigate the marine protected area there as part of the monitoring program for that marine protected area. And we were able to deploy 158 gear deployments. We collected over 700 live seafloor images and 3,900 specimen photos. And we collected 38,000 individual specimens that have all gone towards research and are part of countless PhD programs and museum collections around the world. And as you can see, we got to investigate a wide range of environments, and it helps us to understand that the South Orkneys aren't just one set environment, and different parts of it might require different management strategies. And the program has also had a wide-reaching impact. We've reached over 1 million Twitter users with the hashtag #SoAntico from the cruise. We advised science for the BBC documentaries like Blue Planet 2 and the forthcoming Frozen Planet 2. There was the Monaco assessment, which was a huge undertaking for SCAR, submissions to the Antarctic Environments Portal, and face-to-face outreach with over 50,000 people through events all over the world. And a huge part of it was networking. The majority of our funding went on bringing people together, with over 90 researchers funded to attend conferences and workshops. 50% of them were early career researchers or from developing Antarctic nations. We chaired 26 conference sessions, and over 20 workshops were funded and supported by us. And we collaborated with a whole bunch of SCAR programs and expert groups and panels, also external groups. And also, really importantly, because this was about people and networking, we work with groups such as Minorities in Polar Research, Women in Polar Science, and Pride in Polar Research. Now, we also contributed science towards policy. And this is a really important part of the program, where towards the end, that last major research question was about conservation. And we've submitted articles to CAMLAR, we've put them into the Antarctic Environments Portal, and things have gone to the Antarctic Treaty. So it's really important to consider the end products of the science, and not that just it's fantastic science, but it's actually making a difference.
2 minutes.
So I'd just like to kind of start to bring it to a close there and say that it really has been a pleasure to work as part of Antico. It's felt more like a family at times than a science project. Everyone who's contributed over the last 8 years, it's been amazing, especially meeting you all at conferences. And that's one of the saddest things about not being able to get together in person, is not to see those faces that we've seen over the last 8 years and beyond. And we really hope that the legacy will be an increased understanding of the ecology of Antarctica, and a continuation, and this is the really important legacy, of many of the collaborations forged during this really international program. And we couldn't finish this presentation without mentioning Guido de Prisco, who sadly died last year. He was an enormous mentor to all of us. He particularly helpful to Jan and I. He was always there if we had any questions for him, and he was actively engaged in science. And I think the last time I saw him was about 1.5 years ago at a SCAR meeting that Julian organized. So it's a real tragic loss, and we just wanted to mark that at the end of our talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh, for a fascinating presentation. We do have some questions that have come in on the Q&A, and I personally was intrigued, made me want to hear more about things like how indeed you've informed the physical sciences, which I know a little of, but I won't cut across the questions which we've got coming in at the moment. We do have a few minutes before the next presentation. So I guess the question I'll give first, Guernsey, because they came in first, was a very general one, open for you. What was the most surprising finding or research that you feel came out of Antico?
Oh, there are so many, it's really difficult to choose, but actually one of them is the concept that we're always told that Antarctic organisms will suffer as a result of climate change. And there's a lot of negative impacts. And that's not to say these won't happen. But one of the things that a lot of the research said was that there will be some Antarctic organisms that are on the edges of their ranges at the moment, just clinging on in the cold, that will do better with climate change. And that will fundamentally change the structure of the ecosystem. So even without invasive species, warming could completely change the way that ecosystem functions. So that to me was really interesting. Instead of thinking, we all know about the organisms that will die if it gets warmer, but the most dramatic impact could come from the ones that actually flourish if it gets warmer. And that is something that I hadn't really got my head around before this 8 years of work, I think.
Thank you. And since time is our friend at the moment, another one which particularly caught my eye, the rather sobering findings you recounted about plastics in the Antarctic. How do plastics get to the Antarctic?
You see, a year or so ago, I couldn't have answered this question because in the paper, the amount of plastic produced by local inhabitants, so us as researchers and fishermen and things and tourists, didn't account for the amounts that were being found. But the Ceridwen Fraser of New Zealand published a paper recently about how kelp was getting into the Antarctic using a new way of modeling ocean currents that included gyres and storms and other things that push material closer to Antarctica, whereas the natural processes push it away from Antarctica. So actually, it can get in there quite naturally. The polar front isn't as impermeable as we thought. And the other thing we found is that the highest concentrations are generally close to where people are living as well. So you can, sewage outfall, for example, is a big thing where people are washing clothes and things like that. So there are various reasons, but actually nowhere is safe from plastic, even the Antarctic.
That's fascinating. And so 1 minute question for you, which I think will cut across many of our themes. What is the most important priority for this research area, given the limitations in conducting research due to the pandemic? And I think this might be a bit of a thread for us.
I think it's to remember that we all have collections all around the world. And we collected a lot of material in the So Antico expedition, for example. And we have PhD students that never need to go to Antarctica that can learn a lot from that existing material. So whilst we're stuck at home, there are still huge resources in national collections and museums where we could be learning a lot that we haven't studied yet. And I think the idea of going back to what we've already collected is really important when we can't go there and collect anything new.
Thank you very much, Hugh. That was a fascinating presentation and great answers. We'll come back in the discussion at the end. Our next talk I'd like to introduce now is going to look at the program called ANT-ERA. Now, ANT-ERA stands for Antarctic Thresholds, Ecosystems, Resilience and Adaptation. This program has been extremely important, facilitated research primarily but not exclusively on climate change-induced ecological processes in Antarctic, marine, limnetic and terrestrial systems. ANT-ERA considered all levels of biological organisation, ranging from molecules and species to communities and ecosystems. Today we're going to hear about the ANT-ERA program from Professor Julian Gutt, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Julian, go ahead please.
Good morning, everybody. I think it was Andy Clark who developed during a first preparatory workshop of the new programs in 2011, this question, how close to the cliff are we? Describing in a popular way the mission of ANT-ERA. Some biologists didn't like this popular language. However, in a general talk during the Open Science Conference in Portland in 2012, I mentioned this question. And after my talk, a geophysicist approached me with a kind of compliment. Julian, this was the first time that I understood what biologists really want to do. So it obviously had a positive effect. I will come back to this question later during this presentation. And I will continue now with some facts about our funding and events. Since science was and still is the core of Antira, I will talk briefly about our scientific synthesis. At the end, I will provide some own impressions and the lessons we learned. In our total 8-year budget, the blue proportions in this pie chart indicate the funds which went directly or indirectly to early career scientists. I would like to highlight here our spring course in Buenos Aires in 2018, in which 46 students participated from 9 countries, primarily from South America, but also from Malaysia, India, and Ukraine. This spring course was a great experience for both for the students and the lecturers, primarily due to the excellent ambition of the students. We were also quite happy about the hospitality of the host, and the lecturers did their best. Concerning our budget, it was my personal approach not only to support visits of already existing meetings like the SCAR Open Science Conference, but to create opportunities for unique and new discussions and concepts like our spring course, for example. But there were more of such unique events to which more than 60% of our funds went. Here also in blue, a post-expedition meeting in Dijon, in France, an interdisciplinary brainstorming exercise in Barcelona, which you already mentioned, and we had a final synthesis workshop in Coimbra in Portugal last year. In addition, we organized larger side events, for example, during the biology symposium in Belgium to discuss the future of scar biology, and in Davos on Arctic-Antarctic comparisons, but these side events didn't demand specific Antira funds. In this map, you see the SCAR countries, only the SCAR countries, and in dark blue, the countries where the recipients of our funds came from. I'm happy with this quite good coverage, and I'm also quite happy with this gender ratio, but we have to consider that both the geographic coverage and the gender ratio not only indicate our personal selection, but they also reflect from which country or from which individual scientist, male or female, we received the most applications. In our scientific synthesis, we identified 10 main messages from the work of the past 10 years, focusing on biological processes. And I will go through these now very, very briefly. Number 1, changes in biogeochemical cycles can develop in different directions. Secondly, there are losers, but also a few species likely to benefit from ocean acidification. Number 3, responses to climate change and climate change hotspots are not simple, they are very complex, non-linear, and variable. 4, the benthos is more dynamic than previously thought. 5, in terms of climate-induced range shifts, similarities exist between marine and terrestrial systems. 6, protein production and protein damage play important roles in physiological adaptation. 7, many details have been elaborated on sea ice as a driver for a broad variety of species. 8, the response of organisms to pollutants, particularly new pollutants like microplastics, is largely understudied. 9, species on land are endangered due to less isolation after melting of ice and consequently increasing competition. Finally, specific ecological conditions shape newly discovered habitats such as seamounts, seeps, coral aggregations, and under ice communities. You probably remember this question, and here are my personal and popular answers based on the scientific results. The cliff is not a vertical cliff. It is a kind of a slalom ski slope. At the peninsula, we are already at the upper part of this ski slope, going mainly down, sometimes also a little bit up, sometimes to the left and to the right, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, sometimes we do some loopings, sometimes some jumps, but we cannot look around the next corner, and we do not see the finishing line at all. In most other regions, especially in the East Antarctic, we still stand at the starting point. At least we know from physical sciences and from the knowledge on the low plasticity of high latitude organisms that the starting point of the slope is close to us if we are not already underway. But also in this case, in the rest of the Antarctic, we do not yet know how steep this slope is, and we don't know where it ends. If we do not want to continue this blind downslope race or journey, we have to stop or reduce global climate change. That's the popular answer based on the results from Antarctic ecosystems. Now, on my personal experience, I think our integrative approach and to represent a scientifically diverse community was the basis for our success. And it was not always easy, but it was a great pleasure for me to share this program. An integrative approach meant that we did not split up into male and female and poor and rich and emerging and traditional programs, East and West, young and old, and also not into terrestrial and marine themes. Comparing marine and terrestrial themes does not always make sense. For example, to compare biodiversities or ecosystem services on land with those in the ocean. As a consequence, nature conservation strategies demand totally different justifications and approaches. However, a comparative approach makes sense if we discuss something like range shifts, or when we look at adaptation mechanisms, or increasing or decreasing primary production due to climate change. We have the greening of the Antarctic Peninsula on land, and we have, at least regionally, an increase in phytoplankton growth in the ocean. We also came to the conclusion that we still need the fundamental research to support applied aspects. For example, we must understand the adaptation of species and the resilience of communities to predict the future of Antarctic ecosystems. The basis for our success was also always the ambition of colleagues who contributed to our output. However, this volunteer work is only possible when it is also supported by science managers, by institute directors, and by the national delegates. Of course, also SCAR itself, especially the office in Cambridge, was essentially important for our success. Finally, a personal wish and a comment. I think that SCAR should not leave climate-related research, particularly when related to changes in the ice, in water chemistry, and variables of physical oceanography, so to speak, to SCAR satellites. Some of these form quite impressive communities in the past few years. I belong to some of these communities. They are powerful, but they exist, so to speak, to my opinion, only at the periphery of SCAR. I think SCAR's periphery is not the best place to facilitate such important climate-related scientific themes. Independently of all strategies, the work under the SCAR umbrella was and is always successful when people, independently of gender, of ethnic affiliation, or stage of career, respect each other. In this context, not by chance, one name comes into my mind, which you mentioned already, and he is representative for many other colleagues. It is Guido di Prisco. He was such an ambitious Antarctic scientist and played an important role in developing Antira 8 years ago. We had 2 meetings in Italy in this preparatory phase organized by Guido. Due to his fair and open-minded character and his respect, he became a good friend, not only of mine. He left us last year after he still participated in our synthesis workshop, but we will never forget him.
Thank you, Julian. That's been a really interesting presentation, and we have time for at least a question. I have one question that I think might play to what you would like to talk about particularly. It's a very good one. How do you think wider attitudes to climate change and its impact on the Antarctic have changed since the program started 8 years ago?
That is difficult to answer. I think our knowledge increased very significantly. We know that climate change in the Antarctic, especially at the peninsula, started already 40, 50 years ago. But if we look again at this simple question from Andy Clark, how close to the cliff are we? That was the popular question. We didn't know how close to the cliff, whatever the cliff is, whether it is a slope or a cliff. We didn't know how close we were. Now we know, I would like to repeat this, we are already on the way, downslope, upslope, left, right, or whatever. And in the East Antarctic, things are also changing since a couple of years. As I mentioned, the sea ice is reducing, and that will have an impact on the ecosystems.
Thank you, Julian, for that really interesting answer and response, and look forward to chatting a little bit more at the end. So let's move on in our presentations now, and for something quite different, not looking down at what's beneath our feet in Antarctica, but looking upwards and outwards and using the amazing platform that Antarctica is to look at our universe around us. And that's the Astronomy and Astrophysics from Antarctica, SRP. This group incorporates all astronomical and near-Earth observation studies made from the Antarctic continent, spanning all wavelengths and methods, and has fairly recently progressed from being an SRP when it concluded to an expert group. But we look forward to hearing now from Dr. Tony Travaillon, who can tell us about the work of this very important SRP. Thank you, Tony.
Hello, my name is Tony Travaillon. I would like to present a few slides about the activities happening in Antarctica for the astronomical sciences. I represent the steering committee of AAA, which consists of the following name, and I would like to thank the contributors from the different countries who gave me the slides I'm going to present. So first of all, I'd like to mention that astronomy in Antarctica has a large footprint in terms of what we do. We're not just dealing with astronomical objects, but also include magnetosphere research, space weather, and with some upcoming interest in space traffic and communications, for example. Obviously, we have a lot of interest in the bases based in the plateau of Antarctica. The altitude makes a big difference. So we're looking for places that have low cloud coverage, high elevation. The temperature is important, of course, and more. The one important new aspect about astronomy, which I think is worth pointing out, is that in the recent years there's been a bit of a revolution in the sense that we are no longer just a science using photons for our research, but also measuring particles of high energy coming from the cosmos, as well as gravitational waves, which is basically the latest development in the field. So now we're talking about multi-messenger astronomy, and we're trying to capture information coming from all these sources and deduce more about the object we see in the universe. So what I'm going to talk about has obviously a high level of international collaboration, not only in Antarctica, but also involves partnership with other observatories and other physical experiments that take place outside of Antarctica. So I'm going to give you a list of things that happen at different locations. I think it's probably the best way to organize this presentation here. So if we go, for example, to the South Pole is the home of one of the largest scientific experiments, any science combined really. The ice cube of the South Pole Neutrino Observatory is one of the biggest science instruments that you can find right now. So this is basically a cubic kilometer worth of instruments that are there to sample incoming signal from high particles such as neutrinos and muons. So you can actually see the surface of the South Pole here near the top, and this square kilometer then is augmented by a third dimension, a third kilometer worth of area here, to essentially captures by this huge amount of detectors the path that the neutrinos take as they go through the ice here. IceCube has been now operational for almost a decade now. It's fully operational. It's making a high level of measurements. Every day we capture, for example, some neutrinos coming from different types of sciences. So if you look at what IceCube does as a whole, we've got what we call astrophysical neutrinos, about 10 a year, which come from cataclysmic events, such as big explosions happening in the cosmos, and we're capable of locating the source of those by combining this information with other types of messengers. We also capture cosmic rays as they interact in the atmosphere and become neutrinos. And we can also measure muons in very large quantities. So these three types of signal, these three types of information here, those high particle messengers, bring a lot of new physics. For example, there is no evidence right now that there is a fourth sterile neutrino based on the information on the now almost a decade worth of data that we got from IceCube. The astrophysics of neutrinos also is now really mature, and now we're capable of closing on neutrino sources. And this is really now a partnership that involves a lot of telescopes all around the world to try to find the sources of emission of high energy neutrinos here. And similar, there's a lot of discoveries happening in the cosmic array around here. There is a path to upgrade the instrument to basically become a lot larger and become sensitive to much higher energy range. So looking at neutrinos that are from the tera electron volt and beyond here. If we move higher up on the continent at Dome Sea, then we have mostly instruments working in the visible, in the infrared, and the sub-millimeter. So these are some examples of instruments led by Italy, for example. So there is one of the SuperDown antenna. So SuperDown is basically an instrument that is there to measure magnetospheric waves and mesospheric winds. ESCAPE is a coronagraph that's studying the sun. We have ITM, which is a telescope that has a lot of purposes that currently under refurbishment. And there is the upcoming COSMO, which will be there to make some cosmic microwave background radiation measurements. So these are the kind of science that these three experiments will do. I can't go into too much detail in that amount of time, but since it's a recording, I think you can browse to your leisure at a later date. Cosmology is obviously a big component of this. Looking at the early universe, looking at the time of recombination, when matter as we know it was formed through this kind of telescope. Also taking place at Dome Sea, but now led by France's the A-Step telescope, which now looks at something a bit different. It's looking at exoplanets, so planets that are orbiting around other stars. By using the fact that in Antarctica you can actually use the same a year to make continuous measurements of the same star, you can actually see the impact of having a planet passing in front of a star and basically dimming it. And so this is really a lot easier when you can be in Antarctica, because you can really follow and learn a lot about the decrease of light that you get from those stars, and really learn a lot of information about those exoplanets. So there is a goal to upgrade these facilities to better search for those exoplanets by looking at the same type of object, but in the infrared, for example, and do follow-ups of these detections here. At Dome A, a very similar story, but now we're looking at bases that are a bit more new. Dome A is a base which is not operational full-time, but only during the summer, so it's a lot of robotization, a lot of experiments here, which are also aimed a lot about detecting exoplanets. Now, the good thing about those very high plateaus, and this is what gets astronomers very excited, is that because you have such a thin atmosphere, such a little amount of turbulence, the amount of what we call seeing, the turbulence which reduces the resolution of our observations, is much lower than anywhere else on the planet. And so you can really make observations that are much clearer than most other places. So this is a relatively recent measurements which confirm that there is a lot of potential to do high resolution measurements from Antarctica. China is also leading a very similar exoplanet experiment from the AST series of telescopes. So again, you can see what we call light curves, where you can basically make continuous measurements and look for planets around other stars. Very exciting science here. And of course, the plan is similar to go in the infrared and to go with larger telescopes. So we are talking about 2.5 to 5 meter class telescope, proposing the infrared and the sub-millimeter. Dome F, now led by Japan. Similar story, except that this time there is a lot longer time frame based on the fact that Dome F wasn't continuously occupied. So there is a lot of studies basically ranging from 2006 to 2013 to assert the site as a great place to do a science fair. In the near future, there will be a plan to build a new station called New Dome Fuji Station, about 50 kilometers away from the old station, which obviously has a lot of astronomy in mind, but also core drilling. So it's going to be very close to the location that's currently being used. Astronomers will use the next 5 years to do some remote observations, because it will be only a summer station. But in the future, there is plans for 10-meter class sub-millimeter telescope to really go far beyond what we can do right now. On the coast, there's also activities in astronomy, but also in basically space weather. So Argentina is one of the leaders in that sense with the LAMP lab, which is part of the whole heliosphere and planetary interaction network. So it's basically a consortium which has a lot of observatories on the world, which looks at weather from the upper atmosphere. So, for example, Argentina is currently working on a NURIS lab, which is at the station of Marimbio, which is just to the tip of the peninsula here, which does a lot of measurements and is part of consortium like one of the LEGO node that looks at a cosmic ray coming through the upper atmosphere here. So they're looking at magnetosphere and a lot of other activities that regard to space weather. So this is a selection of the latest that these people do here as part of a large network around the world here. This is also something which is also done from McMurdo. McMurdo has a lot of activity that regards space weather, but also astronomy using balloons. So the way for astronomers to go as far as they can from the atmosphere, but still be capable of come at a much cheaper price than, let's say, space, is to put telescopes on balloons. It's cheaper, we can use larger aperture, therefore we can have a better resolution. And thanks to the circumpolar vortex, we can actually keep our telescopes and essentially pick them up after they go around the continent a few times. So these kind of balloons here, this is a BLAST, which is launched at McMurdo here, is basically looking at the molecular clouds, so essentially dust in the galaxy. That is the seed for star-forming region. So on the left, you can see, for example, a comparison from space with a Planck telescope, which is smaller than what BLAST can do from the upper atmosphere, and you can actually see the increase in resolution in those maps that can be achieved. And so each of those darker regions will basically correspond to a future place for stars to form, and then you can actually study the chemistry of what's happening in those very cold part of the universe. So I think that does a good job at summarizing what happens all across the continent. This is unexhaustive. There is a lot of cosmic microwave background research done. There's a lot of solar research done, but that gives you a small sample of the exciting research done in astrophysics from Antarctica. And I think I'm ready for questions.
Tony, thank you very much. That was a very interesting and, if not dazzling, presentation of the amazing things that can be done in the unique environment that Antarctica is. We do have a couple of questions, and I think, again, connecting with the times that we're in at the moment, I would certainly be interested to hear. I know astronomy is a hugely internationally networked endeavour. And the question arises, how are these multinational projects affected by COVID? And do people from different countries have to isolate from each other? I guess as a jump off to how you see your field navigating this difficult time.
Well, I think for existing project, I think we're doing pretty well. One of the skills that we learn when we go to Antarctica to build those large machines is that we have to make them robotic, which means that we can remote control them and rely on as few people as possible. And so for all the operations that's already in place, I think we're in a good shape. The networks of telescopes around the world is actually quite operational. Where we're taking a hit, I think, is basically for projects that are about to come up online this year. We've had some upgrades of some existing telescopes that have been delayed by 1 year, taking into consideration the reduced logistical support we will get during the summer.
And another interesting question, I think, and I observed this too, it's a really huge range of astronomical projects taking place. To what extent do you see astronomers working across projects, or are they actually quite isolated in terms of their networking between the different wavelengths and instruments?
So I think you said it perfectly right. I mean, astronomers historically like to organize themselves by wavelength. We've got the infrared astronomers, the optical astronomers, and so on. But I think Antarctica is trying to break that mold. I was mentioning earlier in my talk this multi-messenger approach, where now we are dealing with not just measuring photons of multiple wavelengths, but adding information from new facilities like LIGO, where we're measuring gravitational wave and we get a general direction of a part of the sky where we can look for these cataclysmic events. And so then the astronomers with the telescope can now point to this direction and look for the signal and try to hunt down the event which caused those gravitational waves. So I think there is a dichotomy which is changing right now, and we're becoming a lot more networked, I guess, with physical sciences as a whole.
Yes, so I'm hearing a very cross-wavelength networked community. That's exciting, that's interesting. Well, everyone, that brings us up to the time for a scheduled break. We have 5 minutes in the schedule, and I'd ask you to be ready to resume at 55 minutes after the hour. Thank you. How about I say that again? I don't know whether I had my mic on mute. We're resuming after a break at 55 minutes after the hour. Thank you. And welcome back, everyone. Our next SRP is AntClim 21. AntClim 21 stands for Antarctic Climate Change in the 21st Century. And this special research program looks at the overarching question of how will Antarctic environment change over the 21st century. This has involved an integrated approach bringing together climate models, observations, paleoclimate records, and linking physical, chemical and biological realms. This session will be presented by Dr. Thomas Bracegirdle. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you very much. So, just changing to slideshow. Thank you very much, Taz. So today I will show some key highlights of AntClim 21 and give a flavour of the work that's been done over the last 8 years. But I must say a big thank you to everyone else who's been involved in AntClim 21 over the years. Nancy Bertler, who spent the first 4 years as Chief Officer, Alia Khan, Gerhard Krinner, Paul Majewski, and Marilyn Raphael, Jolan Russer and John Turner, all who played a big role in the things I'll show today. And of course, the membership of AntClim 21 as well, who have all contributed in many ways to all our workshops over the years. The overarching question of AntClim 21 is, how will the Antarctic and Southern Ocean climate system change over the 21st century? And we structured the research into this and the collaborations in 3 themes. The first theme was quantification of Antarctic climate variability, and then theme 2 on climate model verification, and theme 3 on Antarctic climate change projections and impacts to the year 2100 and beyond. So focusing first on theme 1, it's very interesting to look back actually, because our first workshop, I think it was maybe the first workshop of AntClim 21 in 2013. And this was specifically on the question of Antarctic climate variability. And I've decided to show a plot here of sea ice extent in the modern satellite era since 1979, because this is a key integrator of the ocean and the atmosphere and the ice system and its variability. And a very intriguing question is why we see a slight increase in sea ice area in the observational record in a warming world. And as part of the output from this workshop, we produced a paper led by Paul Majewski on the potential for Southern Hemisphere climate surprises. And at that time, we were looking ahead and thinking of how the climate system could change in the coming years, and looking back to longer term records and what they could tell us. But of course, we didn't expect this. So after a gradual increase of sea ice extent over a number of years, in the last few years, we've seen a sudden decline in sea ice. So I wouldn't say we predicted it at this workshop, but it was an interesting example of the fact that the recent observational record is probably not quite long enough to give us a good impression of how variable the Antarctic climate system can be and some of the rapid changes we might expect. So linking modern observations with past reconstructions is a key part of AntClim 21, and we've produced lots of excellent science over the years linking these together. We've looked at Antarctic Peninsula warming and then the more recent absence of that warming. We've looked at the Ross Sea dipole, and we've linked together the broader community in a bigger paper, linking together pages and other networks. In terms of climate model verification for the Antarctic region, that has been a really big part of AntClim 21. And of course, if you think about it, what defines a good climate model is a very difficult question. So climate models are complex mathematical representations of the real world. But of course, whether or not it's a good climate model really depends on what questions you're asking. For ANCLIM 21, the focus is on future projections and supporting informed decision-making and quantifying uncertainty. So combining observations and models, which are our theory of how the world works, is of fundamental importance to science. And so it really was a key effort in ANCLIM 21. And as part of this, we organized a big workshop, the Great Antarctic Climate Hack, which was led by Joe L. N. Russell. And it was a fantastic workshop, mainly because through SCAR, we were able to bring together a multidisciplinary community based perspective on evaluating climate models that would be very difficult to do without SCAR's networks. We brought together oceanography, glaciology, atmospheric research, aquatic biogeochemistry, and biology. We also brought together researchers from more than 17 countries, a proportion of whom were early career scientists. And in current times, it's actually interesting to think that we organized this workshop with a huge effort in online participation, and approximately half the 92 participants joined us online from around the world. And that was an interesting early indication of how that can also help to connect the wider community. And this is just a representation of all the different groups that came together for that workshop. So another aspect of major success of ANCLIM 21 has been to link into some of the amazing new observations that have been coming through from projects such as the SOCOM project, where many new platforms for observing the ocean have become available and are now able to observe ocean change under sea ice, for example. And that's helped to give us insights into how the ocean is changing in new areas in recent years. And also the development of an online climate model atlas that was part of a collaboration between SOCOM and ANCLIM 21. And then Antarctic climate change projections and impacts to 2100 and beyond. This aspect has brought together many different linkages. And again, starting with basic climate model research, improved climate projections, and being able to take those into policy, linking to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Antarctic Climate Change and Environment, ACCE report, which after it was originally produced has also developed into a very important annual update for policymakers and for use within SCAR. We contributed reports to the Antarctic Environments portal as well. And then we've developed a very strong collaboration with the Ice Sheet Model into Comparison project, which is part of the current new development of climate models that's becoming available for the next IPCC report, CMIP 6, and advise them on these climate models in their future projections. Antira and Antico, in collaborations with them, these other SCAR SRPs, have produced some of our highest impact science in terms of terrestrial change and also ocean changes. So we've been, over the years, made a big impact scientifically, but also in terms of other aspects of communication, so through Twitter and Facebook, and reaching a much wider audience. And up until recently, we've continued to produce papers that are now still just being published and are being cited in the currently developing IPCC report. And for me, probably a huge thing I will take away from working with ANCLIM 21 is the vibrant international community that we've developed over the years. So this is a photo from last year's 2019 workshop in Cambridge. And the people you see here represent a range of disciplines that have come into the project over a number of years. And like previous speakers, it's such a shame that we can't meet in person this year, but it's great to be able to do this online. Another aspect that's really important to ANCLIM 21
2 minutes remain.
supporting and encouraging early career researchers. We've had early career representation on the ANCLIM 21 steering committee right from the start. Alia Khan was selected through APEX, and she's sat on our committee ever since. She joined as a PhD student and is now an assistant professor. So we've seen her move through different career stages. Certainly we've benefited in terms of, or ANCLIM 21 has benefited massively in terms of better linkages with the early career community. And hopefully there's been a reciprocal benefit, and that Alia has also benefited through her career. We've supported attendance at major science meetings, conferences and workshops, such as last year's workshop in Cambridge as well. So to finish, I mean, one of the feelings in putting this presentation together is partly a sadness that the last 8 years is coming to an end, but also that there should be a determination that the legacy from ANCLIM 21 should continue into the future, and those networks and teams and excellent connections that have been developed over the years can hopefully continue into the future through different strands of activities within SCAR and also more widely. And finally, without the support of SCAR, this really wouldn't have been possible. And it's been great to have the opportunity to develop the science and the excellent opportunities over the years. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Tom, for a really comprehensive and interesting presentation. That was great. In order to keep on time as best we can, we'll have just one question at this stage, and the one I'm going to choose from the suggested list is, from your own perspective, what's the biggest climate surprise that you think has come from the program?
That's a good question. Probably the oh, that is a good question. I mean, the sea ice one, the rapid drop in sea ice, was quite a big surprise. But in a number of ways, it might be less a surprise than the slight increase that happened before. So, and I suppose also the large, one of the things we've learned is that the huge regional variability of the Antarctic climate system, and how much it can, and I guess the strength of connections to regions like the tropics. I mean, what's become more and more clear is that the interconnectedness of the Antarctic system, and how big an impact that can have on the variability of really delicate balances on the coast of Antarctica, on West Antarctica, and the ice sheets. So that's probably the biggest, one of the biggest things I'll take back from the last few years.
Thank you, Tom, very much for that. So we'll move along now to the next SRP, and that's the Solid Earth Response and Influence on Cryospheric Evolution, or CERSE. I think I'm pronouncing that correct, but I must confess, Pippa might have to actually check me out on that one. It'll be presented by Dr. Pippa Whitehouse, but CERSE has been looking at the overarching objective of solid Earth response and influence on cryospheric evolution, looking at ice dynamics, mass balance, and the way the solid Earth interacts with the cryosphere. This objective has been accomplished through integrated analysis and incorporation of geological, geodetic, and geophysical measurements into models of glacial isostatic adjustment and ice sheet dynamics. Pippa, take it away, please.
Thank you very much, Taz. You have the pronunciation right there. I call it CERSE. There were a few names. So I'm Pippa Whitehouse. I'm one of the chief officers of CERSE, and I'm presenting on behalf of other chief officers that have run this SRP. And as Taz mentioned, we're interested in interactions between the solid Earth and the cryosphere. I will quickly outline who we are, and then I will talk through some of the science highlights that we've seen in the last 8 years, how we've involved you in that activity, and also how our visibility has grown, which has enabled us to actually make some leaps forward due to collaborative research. CERSE was initially established by Terry Wilson, and she was our chief officer for the first 4 years of this SRP. And you see her there in her element in the field of Antarctica. The chief officer position was taken over by myself and Matt King for the last 4 years. We also have a steering committee, which is around 20 people. We have 6 ECRs on that committee, and we represent 12 countries. And the breadth of disciplines represented there really covers the scientists that come under the remit of CERSE. We cover geodesy, geodynamics, geology, glaciology, geophysics, seismology, and remote sensing. We have one subgroup on geothermal heat flow, which was just formed 2 years ago, and has become one of the most active areas in the last years, which is really exciting. And we have a mailing list. We have over 200 subscribers, and I put over 27 countries there. I identified people by their email address sources, but obviously many people will be working in countries that I'm not aware of, and may be working overseas. What I've seen throughout our training schools is a number of early career researchers that actually move around and study in different countries. And it's just really exciting to see the sort of diversity that we have in our membership. I haven't listed there the male-female split. From our site meeting 2 years ago, we're about 1/3 women and 2/3 men. But some of the activities we run are much more even, and our training schools are very much 50-50. Our objective is to advance understanding of the interactions between the solid Earth and the cryosphere, to better constrain 3 things: ice mass balance, ice sheet dynamics, sea level change. Now, those might seem quite a big jump from trying to understand the solid Earth. So I'll just quickly explain how solid Earth is important for these 3 processes. Typically, this is the picture that people might have of solid Earth deformation underneath an ice sheet, the growth of an ice sheet to form the land underneath. So how does this contribute to our understanding of ice sheet change, sea level change? There's 2 ways. Firstly, one of the primary ways we study changes across the whole ice sheet is to use satellites, specifically satellites. But it turns out that this deformation of the land underneath the ice sheet, which is ongoing, it's subsiding or rebounding in response to past and contemporary ice sheet change, actually is picked up by those very satellites. So we have to account for that deformation. We need to understand that process. The other area in which the solid Earth is important is because it turns out that when you melt an ice sheet, the change in sea level across the globe is not uniform. And this comes due to the deformation of the solid Earth and the changes to the gravity field. And this image on the bottom right here from Mitrovica et al. In 2009 highlights the fact that in these pale areas, you get less than average sea level rise from a melting in Antarctica. And actually this red area highlights you actually get sea level fall near Antarctica. But importantly, in the far field, these dark blue areas, you get greater than average sea level change when you melt West Antarctica. So these two things to do with ice sheet change and sea level change, they feed into these community activities, ice sheet mass balance exercises, the WCRP, and feeding into the IPCC, as Valerie spoke about earlier. But at the start of CERSI, there wasn't really a community home for people studying this process, often called glacial isostatic adjustment. And CERSI really created that home and fostered some real leaps forward in the science. I put up our overarching aim again here. I just want to talk about a couple of science highlights. The first I'm going to talk about is this idea of isostatic deformation, rebound and subsidence in response to ice sheet change. The typical way that we do this is we try and recreate how the ice sheet has changed. We model the response to that and test it with measurements, typically of how the land is rebounding today. We put together a review of GIA, of this sort of rebound process last year, and you can see that there's much variability in the rebound rates. What I really want to draw attention to here is the ways in which these estimates on the right were created. From forward modelling, inverse modelling, coupled modelling, 1D and 3D modelling. You don't need to understand the details, but what I've underlined here are fields which didn't exist at the start of CERSI, and CERSI has really fostered progress in these areas. Much of our work is based on observations. So early on in CERSI, we started to get excellent observations from GPS measurements demonstrated here by the. Actually, what we realized that the rebound that we were modeling in response to ice sheet change was much smaller than what we were actually observing. These papers here are about rapid uplift. And that told us that the land underneath Antarctica is not typical Earth structure. It's actually much weaker and it deforms in an unexpected way. So this led to this first area of 3D GIA modelling. And a separate strand of work that's gone on under CERSI is to use seismology to understand the pattern of the structure inside the Earth. You might not be able to see the outline of Antarctica here, but the blue area is East Antarctica, and this red area is West Antarctica, which tells us that when you load or unload the Earth, growing or shrinking an ice sheet, those areas deform very, very differently, and our models really weren't capturing that at the start of CERSI. If you put that information into models, there are serious implications for what we actually end up with interpreting the GRACE data and also thinking about sea level fingerprints. That's one massive leap forward that we've seen during CERSI. The other area is to think about the impact on the dynamics of the ice sheet. And actually, when CERSI was reviewed in its proposal stage, a reviewer commented that there's no impact on ice sheet dynamics, and we're happy to prove them wrong. Effectively, as the shape of the solid Earth changes underneath the ice sheet, you change the boundary conditions for ice flow. This was set out by Natalia Gomez in a paper in 2010, and the main point here is that it counteracts the unstable ice sheet retreat that we see under the MISI process, and actually it can act to stabilize ice sheet loss. What we don't know is the extent of that stabilization at the moment. This has been applied to modeling Antarctica through tens of thousands of years, and questions are now being asked about the strength of that feedback. How much can we slow ice loss due to solid Earth rebound? There's hints of evidence that has happened in the past, that it's actually slowed or maybe caused a re-advance. And the one thing that's missing in here at the moment is combining this coupled modeling, so feedbacks between the ice sheet and solid Earth, with that other area, 3D Earth structure. And that's starting to be investigated, but there's a lot more here to do, both in terms of the data that feed into our understanding and also us propagating our uncertainty on what's happening. I'm just going to talk about one more area that's shown on this diagram, and it's to do with the basal properties of ice sheet dynamics. So I've so far spoken about the shape of the Earth. What's actually the boundary conditions for the ice sheet? And we found out that actually the CERSI was a real home for people studying geothermal heat flow. This emerged just a couple of years ago. We received a request from some people in the group to hold a small meeting in Hobart, actually. And then at the side meeting, at the last SCAR meeting, it became apparent that there were many people interested in GHS from a range of backgrounds. And we've recently published a white paper in this area. And it's really exciting to see this sort of organic growth of this area under CERSI. Another area to quickly highlight, again, coming from that geophysics side of CERSI, is to understand the boundary conditions using glacial seismology. Again, an area which didn't really exist at the start of CERSI. So we feel like there's some really exciting changes that have happened during the lifetime of CERSI. And the question to look at finally in this last couple of slides is how we've done this. And it's really through bringing people together. We don't fund the research, but we fund the opportunity for people to come and discuss the research. The red activities you see here are some of our big workshops that we've held, with one to happen next year. And the blue areas over here you see are some training schools that we have held. I'd just like to draw your attention to the final column here as well. The training schools were all recorded. We have videos on the web of all its activities. So there's a real lasting legacy from CERSI. Most of our funds went to early career researchers and as much as we could to researchers from countries with emerging Antarctic programs. I think we need more visibility in some of those countries as well, but we absolutely bring those people into the activities that we hold. We are very, very collaborative. We'd like to acknowledge the support from the other groups. And one last thing to really like to highlight on this page is some statements on future research that we have put together. The last couple of workshops we've held essentially a horizon scanning process, a mini horizon scan, and put forward some questions for the research community to look at in the next 10 to 15 years. Just a quick note on the training schools. These are very busy slides, I realise. You can watch this again later and get in the details. But I'd just like to highlight again the breadth of people that we've engaged through CERSI. And there's large number of countries that are represented. We actually got 4 times the number of applicants for the number of places we had. So we ran the whole meeting as a virtual. This was back in 2015, a bit of a pioneering experiment. And as I said, the video is available online. And we found that everyone really enjoyed that real international mix of the participants and the chance to interact with the instruments. So just to conclude, CERSI is coming to an end. We've made some leaps forward. We've also identified many areas that need new work. Some of that will happen in focused research, but also some requires collaboration. This figure I've been showing throughout, it includes some aspects of other research programs, the atmospheric input and the ocean input. We are absolutely involved in the instant proposal for the next SLP, and we welcome that opportunity for other people to hear some of the conversations that we've been having in CERSI and see what connections can be made. A final call is just to make a point about data. Data really underpin a lot of our studies, and we're seeing now that autonomous data are really useful when we can't get to Antarctica. We have many instruments collecting data, but they're not really, don't have a long-term sort of lifetime. So our final activity we're going to run in CERSI is to discuss that for the future. So I'd just like to thank SCAR for the opportunity to bring together so many people from so many different backgrounds, and really the inclusivity that is an ethos that runs through SCAR has helped us create an environment that has made it very easy for discussions to take place, and some really exciting leaps forward to occur as we try and understand interactions between the solid Earth and the Antarctic ice sheet.
Thank you very much, Pippa, for a very comprehensive coverage of a really complicated program of research. What we'll do, I think, is take just one question, which is kind of a nice question for those who aren't so close to the physics of ice sheets and sea level. But what parts of the globe, now where I see that question, are most at risk from Antarctica's ice sheet loss?
So that's a great question, and ironically, it's the parts furthest away from Antarctica. I can point you to some great summary papers, but essentially what happens when an ice sheet melts, we tend to get either a little bit of fall of sea level close to that ice sheet or just very small rise. And in the far field, so in this situation for West Antarctica, it's North America, where we see the greatest impact of sea level rise. It's greater than, so if we had 1 millimeter per year of sea level rise from Antarctica, North America might see sort of 1.2, 1.4 millimeters. So there's a real pressing concern. It's the Northern Hemisphere that will be impacted by Antarctica melting.
Thanks very much for that lightning answer to that question. I know there's a lot that underlies it. So our final talk for this session, we're going to move on to looking at past Antarctic ice sheet dynamics. That's the PACE SRP. This is a program aimed at improving understanding of the sensitivity of east, west and the Antarctic Peninsula ice sheets to a broad range of past climatic and oceanic conditions, to improve confidence in predictions of ice sheet and sea level response to future climate change and ocean warming. The PACE research philosophy is based on data model integration into comparison and the development of the ice to abyss data transects extending from the ice sheet interior to the deep sea. This session today is going to be presented by Dr. Laura DeSantis. Please take it away, Laura.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depends where you are. Let me thank the other co-chief officer, as was done by my previous presenters for each of the programs. I'm sharing this very important responsibility with Team Nash, at least in the last 4 years. And I'm also sharing the leading of this huge geoscience program with Carlotta Scuzia and Rob De Conto, who were the first coordinating the program in the first 4 years between 2013 and 2016. And of course, I want to acknowledge also the large steering committee, which is made by at least 30 members from 15 countries and involving also several young scientists who brought ideas and sparkling activities into the program. As was already said, the basic philosophy for the past Antarctic ice sheet dynamics is to provide information along transects, data transects from the hinterland of the Antarctic ice sheet to the ice proximal to the more distal and deep ocean, and also including far-field records in a longitudinal and latitudinal way to cover a whole bunch of variety in terms of environmental change around the Antarctic margin. The aim is to provide information, multidisciplinary information about the evolution of the Antarctic ice sheet to ice sheet and ice shelf modeling and glacial isostatic adjusted sea level models. So the main questions we want to achieve is basically what was the contribution of the Antarctic ice sheet in the past to sea level change, which is one of the gaps that was recognized, was identified already in 2013 when PACE started to work. And we try to do it by trying to constrain the rate and amplitude of past change of the Antarctic ice sheet and which are the tipping points the Antarctic ice sheet crosses during its during the Cenozoic time frame. So the area the PACE community has been focusing more is basically in 3 key environments to provide information about basal hydrology, about the evolution of the continental margin, and the interaction between the ocean and the ice sheet back in time. So the overall aim was to reconstruct ice volume, atmospheric and oceanic temperature to identify past polar amplification and assess forcing and feedbacks. A few examples of past subglacial hydrology comes from two recent work, one in the Amundsen Sea, the one to the left by Gerard Kuhn, and one from the Ross Sea from Lawrence Sinkins. They provide very nice examples of a paleo subglacial lake and water channel forming right seaward of grounding zone wedge that are key information that inform the model, the ice sheet volume models about the size and the rates of change during the last glacial maximum and past ice sheet retreat. Many other works have been done around the margin of the Antarctica, but there are still two spots. We need much more in the future. And other key works are about understanding the role of pinning points, and pinning points can be constructed as a sedimentary wedge, grounding zone wedge, formed at the base of the ice sheet during the ice sheet retreat, and that's an example from the Ross Sea, which actually acted as a stabilization for the ice sheet during the step back. And the other one is from Kings Lake. Pippa already mentioned this. It's basically ice sheet retreat after the Holocene that re-advance again due to isostatic rebound that create the condition for bedrock shallowing. But what the ice community has been main focusing on is trying to understand the signature of main phases, main episodes that characterize the atmospheric CO2 record and deep sea benthic isotopic records in the Cenozoic. There are significant shifts into these curves that are probably representing thresholds where the Antarctic ice sheet cross tipping points. And so we've been working on seismic unconformities to check in the geophysical data if there is any signature, any information, any evidence of these kind of thresholds, and combining with, of course, a drill site. And if you see at in the bottom line, I labeled some of the unconformities that have been recognized in the Ross Sea, the Wixland, the Amundsen Sea, Weddell Sea. They're all similar in terms of time span range, and they match with some of these key episodes. So this has been possible only in the frame of a large program like PAIS, which allow us to share data in open source data bank like the Seismic Data Library system that allow to use over than 300,000 kilometers of seismic. They are open and free. And of course, the coordination with the International Ocean Discovery Program and the legacy from Andril allow to actually optimize logistical effort and a large investment. So one of the main products of PAIS that comes from this huge effort is the publication of the paleobathymetry of the circumantarctic Southern Ocean that was published recently in 2020 by Katarina Ockmuth, showing how nicely it's possible to actually reconstruct the evolution, the geodynamic evolution, but also the stratigraphic evolution of the Antarctic margin and surrounding continents. This is one of the milestones that will be used by ice sheet models that actually need this information to estimate past ice volume change versus climate. Another interesting product, very important as well, is the one published by Ty Paxman et al. In 2019. And in this case, the Pan-Antarctic topographic evolution is reconstructed back in time up to 34 million years ago. As you see, there are many areas that gradually deepen from terrestrial to shallow water to deep ocean, especially the one in the Western Antarctic ice sheet, but also some sectors of the East Antarctic ice sheet that then make the Antarctic ice sheet much more vulnerable through time. This has been demonstrated also by other models like Gasson. Gasson used this paleobathymetry to build a colder and warmer climate in the Miocene and check how large were the fluctuation in a high CO2 world. And that was constrained very nicely by also drill sites like the one published by Francesca Sangiorgi in 2018 and Richard Levy in 2016 about the Andriel and Wilkesland sites. They found a very high surface temperature warming in the Miocene climatic optimum. And so they raised the point that there was a very strong polar amplification by that time, which is supporting the vulnerability and the high sensitivity of the Antarctic ice sheet in a high CO2 world. This is coupled with other works like the Levy et al. 2019 that actually show that the transition from terrestrial to marine-based ice sheet occurred exactly in the Miocene, when the ice sheet actually carved its own bedrock, as demonstrated by Florence Colleoni et al. In 2018. So the vulnerability of the Antarctic ice sheet increased in the early Miocene to the late Miocene, and that made most of the marine-based sector as vulnerable to ocean warming and responding more to obliquity to the ocean warming, especially in the Miocene when sea ice was not so much developed. When the sea ice developed in the late Miocene to Pliocene up to the present time, that worked as more isolation. So it reduced the sensitivity to ocean warming. But in the future, in a warming world where the sea ice will be reduced, the ice sheet is actually very, very vulnerable because it's landward deepening and over deepened, and so it will be particularly sensitive to high CO2 increase. Of course, we need more data to test these results and to understand the complexity of the environment and how the nature works. So more recently, a lot of work has been focused on understanding the role of the ocean, then how the ocean actually trigger past ice sheet retreat. And of course, many work have been dedicated to understand the Amundsen Sea and the Ross Sea sector, because they are supposed to be the most vulnerable, the most sensitive, where there are the largest ice shelf and where actually has been observed ice sheet and ice shelf thinning fast during the last decades. One of the key work was published by Hillenbrand in 2017 and Smith in 2016 in the Amundsen Sea. So they found that there was a huge reinforcing of the subpolar jet during the glaciation that enhanced upwelling on circumpolar deep water in the Amundsen Sea, both in recent time, in around 1940, between 1940 and 1945, that are of the ungrounding of the Pine Island Glacier in 1970, so very recently, and but also 7,000 years ago. So what Hillenbrand observed is that there is a nice signature in the geochemical composition of forams, showing coupling very nicely with shift in the northern ice mass incursion in the Amundsen Sea. So that means that upwelling of circumpolar deep water actually forced the retreat of the ice shelf and then of the ice sheet in the Pine Island Glacier. A nice work done recently by Tinto et al. By the Rosetta group in general is to test whether the circumpolar deep water is actually reaching the grounding line in the Ross Sea below the Ross Ice Shelf. And it seems that at present, at least, the circumpolar deep water is actually entering the continental shelf, following the route along the main glacial valley below the Ross Ice Shelf, but it doesn't get to the grounding line, which is well 100 kilometers south. And so it's melting the Ross Ice Shelf, the marginal areas, but at present day, it's not a real dangerous, a real risk for the grounding line itself to retreat.
2 minutes.
And yes, thank you. At the IODIC P374 and coupled with the previous Andres site, we'll actually investigate such a process back in time. Sorry. At the edge of the the continental margin. We drilled several sites from the shelf margin, from the deep channel levee on the flank of this canyon. And we found a huge population of foraminifera and also diatom, very thick contouritic deposit on the margin and also in the deep water that will for sure inform about the role of circumpolar deep water in the past by possibly triggering retreat of the ice sheet across this margin. There are a bunch of papers in preparation and some are submitted already, so lots of interesting things will come up soon. Nice work that is already showing a nice link between the Antarctic worm and the ice loss is from the Wixland. Those are data previously collected by the IODP expedition 318 here. And what we see is that there is a correspondence between the provenance, the detrital, and also the productivity at this site during the Pleistocene warmest interval, MIS 11, 7, 9, and 5. And a retreat of the ice sheet has been recorded up to 700 kilometers for MIS 11 along this, the Wilkes Basin here. And that means that for only 2 degrees centigrade, but lasting for quite a long time, something like 2,500 years, it's enough to trigger such a great retreat of the ice sheet, which is equivalent of 3-4 meters of sea level globally. That's a nice compilation by Andrea Dutton that shows that PAIS is able to actually provide numbers about the contribution of the polar ice sheet to the sea level, but what we don't know yet is what's the singular contribution of Antarctic versus Greenland. So that's something we should investigate in the future. And of course, all models that try to match this estimate, like the one from Rob De Conto and Polar 2017, include the physical processes occurring at the base of the ice, what's actually reducing the stability of the ice, like the marine ice sheet stability and the marine ice cliff instability. So these physical processes that were investigated during the PAIS life were actually included into the new generation of models that allow to provide new estimate for the future sea level change, at least with a not so large uncertainty for the next 100 years, but the uncertainty is quite large if we go further in the future. A nice results from Rob De Conto is that in 2500, actually most of the west marine-based Antarctic ice sheet will be gone, and so the sea level globally will rise of 7 meters, and this is strongly based on past constraint. So those numbers are those that the PAIS community were able to provide. Other examples using the past to constrain the future come from Clark, for example, that modeled the future change based on a long time of observation, starting from the last glacial maximum and going in the future up to 10,000 years. That's to test the sensitivity of the Antarctic ice sheet to respond to low or higher high CO2 atmospheric content, and the time to get back to the equilibrium state again. So the last slide is just to show how huge the program is. As I said, we are many scientists, both in the steering committee, but the mailing list is huge. It's more than 300 names in there, lots of young people involved in school and training courses. We had 2 schools organized by Denise Kulainek and Trevor Williams in 2016 and 2019. Very successful, enthusiastic people, which will be the next generation. And we all work in Instant in the future, together with people from CERSI and other program. We have a lot of Discover, and I can say that, as Pippa said, thanks, Scar, because it's really very important to be part of such community and be able to meet other scientists and learn from them and share data and get ideas to high impact publication that will serve future generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, very much for that presentation. Very enjoyable and very interesting. We will shortly move to a general discussion phase, but I thought, as we've done with the other speakers, we'd just ask one question of Laura to begin with, and that is one that's come in on the quick Q&A. Are there plans to drill for more sediment cores on the Antarctic margin?
Yes, we have a plan. There are several proposals already in the system, and some of them have been approved, waiting for scheduling. Some of them need to be revised. And as a PAIS community, we are actually organizing workshops to raise new ideas and coordinate to combine data and come up with new proposals, because there are lots of areas with no data at all. So in order to understand the variability of the Antarctic margin, we really need to get data from such regions. Otherwise, we miss some of the part of the story.
Thank you. So what we'll do now is we'll spend the next nearly 15 minutes just having a more general discussion across the presentations we've heard today. While I remember, I'd like to remind you that after the meeting concludes, there's the meeting hub where you can continue discussions and go on to that virtual forum. Not quite the same as coffee and refreshments, but it will have to do under the circumstances. Also, I've been asked to remind you that there's a contributing author gallery that you can consult and actually look and find out more about the contributors to the presentations that you've seen today. One of the things that reflects my technological challenge here at the moment is driving the Q&A. Now, Johanna's going to be helping me, but if you've asked a question and you feel it's not being addressed, or we've lost track of it because it's somewhere down the feed, don't hesitate to ask a Q&A again, which would be really good. I thought I might start though with one of the points that was raised that I think is a chance to involve everybody, and that is to look at ways that SCAR and the SRPs might look to synergize their activities. There have been some suggestions that perhaps there are opportunities in that regard, and I'd be interested to hear what the presenters would like to say on that score. So put your hand up or indicate your interest and we'll move around in that way. Hugh, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I think it's really important that given that the SRPs don't have money to pay for science, one thing we can do is connect people or international existing programs together. And so like we did with the cruise, I was lucky to have a space on a ship and a slot that we could use. And then I was able to tell people about that and they funded themselves to get to that. It's those kind of opportunistic things which can bring together cross-disciplinary things. Is something we don't do that much of at the moment, but we have huge international programs that go somewhere like the Thwaites Glacier region, for example, and do a lot of work between the US and the UK. But that's all based on glaciological and geological work, and nobody's doing biology in that region at the same time. And if that's one of the fastest changing places for physical sciences, it's probably one of the fastest changing places for biological sciences, or we're missing an opportunity there. So I think something we can do in the future is encourage international programs to bring in elements of other SRPs so that you can monitor the physical environment when we're doing biology, or throw in a bit of biology when they're doing physics, or if you're somewhere where nobody's going to go collecting rocks for the next 100 years, and you see lichen, make sure you've got a license to collect some biology, because you might be the only person ever to collect lichen from there before climate change ruins it all. So I think that idea of we connect that well within our programs, but connecting across for opportunities for making the most of limited resources would be a really good plan.
Thank you. Pippa.
Yeah, I absolutely echo that. I'm lucky enough to have gone to, I think, 4 SCAR conferences now, where we have such a mixture from the different SRPs and different groups. Every time I have a conversation with someone outside my field, I learn something, and I think of something that fosters my research and pushes it forward. I think we create opportunities for those conversations to happen. And I think it's also important to create opportunities where others can listen to those conversations. So many happen around the coffee room, but we want everyone to be involved. Something we thought about a lot in preparing this year's conference was the sessions. They were quite broad. People will have noticed there were fewer sessions. That was on purpose, because we wanted people to come in and listen to what's going on in other fields. And that's something which SCAR can really help with.
So I know, Tony, that you wanted to speak to this. Please go ahead.
Yes, I think it's a good topic, because this year in particular, and potentially next year, we're going to have some limitation with logistics. The path forward isn't very clear. And one thing I learned at the last meeting from another SRP was that while many of us are exclusively working from the south in the Antarctic, there are some opportunities to work also in the Arctic. And for some of us, it may actually be a good place to minimize the logistic in the Antarctic by doing early tests, for example, at bases that are easier to access in the north, run some tests and some preliminary results from the north, use those extra 6 months a bit more wisely, rather than loading more work in the Antarctic summer. So this is something I learned from other SRPs, and I think these kind of discussions are really what this kind of meeting is all about.
Thank you. Now we have another question that's more general, and I like too, and I'm sure any of you could answer this with enthusiasm, but someone asks, how do you get involved in an SRP? Okay, who would like to answer that? Sorry, I've been fiddling with the mute the wrong way. Tom, go ahead.
It's a good question, because actually the main thing you need to do is ask. So I think I speak for the other SPs when I say that we're very inclusive, and we generally encourage people to be involved. But I would say, I think one of the things that maybe we could have improved on is having an obvious place that people can just look and say, this is where I join in, this is where I become involved. So looking to the future, that might be something that I'd be thinking to improve on.
Thanks, Tom, and I'd add that too. I haven't heard of any SRP who wouldn't welcome an approach from an interested researcher, so get in touch with the appropriate people. Now, there is another question which I think might be well answered by one of our more senior SRP people that have seen this around the loops a few times and seen SRPs proposed, but it's a really good question. How do we ensure in SCAR that SRPs actually don't duplicate the work of other bodies and organisations, WCRP programs or whatever? So what's the mechanism by which we ensure a meaningful and not duplicated contribution? Hugh, yes.
I think one of the main things we do is we go through a really rigorous process before new SRPs are launched. So the people who are writing them at the moment, the new ones, have all my sympathy, because when we were writing the new biological ones in 2011 and 2012, there were so many iterations of each one, and it was checked through external review processes, and those kind of things are really looked for. So if you can complement, say, the work of CAMLA, the fisheries organization, in the program, that's great, but you don't want to be doing the job of CAMLA in that program. So I think that's something that the reviewers and the internal processes really try to weed out before we start. And then all of our programs, I think, have changed, in some dramatically, some subtly, since the original plan as well. And that's very often driven by what is required by these external organizations. So there might be a push from within, like the heat flux group, who wanted their own subgroup, whereas you might have something, or we have a question thrown down to us either by someone like the MESO group within, which is a study of the Southern Ocean ecology. And there were loads of additional questions they came to us with that Julian and I then had to help them with in terms of getting scientists to work on those projects. So I think generally, like most things with the Antarctic, it's such a small world and everybody does know each other quite well, that if you're treading on someone's toes, you can let each other know quite in a friendly way and turn it more into a collaboration, I think.
Julian.
My answer would be that because we don't have money for the true research, our mission is to facilitate and if we are good, to coordinate all the different initiatives, different ideas, different programs, to discuss and to compare results. And this is our standalone feature. Maybe not exclusively. There are some others. You just mentioned MESO, and there is SUS, for example, that are similar initiatives like SCAR, SRPs. But our standalone feature is to coordinate and to communicate and not sit at home and doing the research on a base, on a ship, but to discuss all this. If we take this mission serious, then we are not in danger to duplicate something that is happening in the national programs.
Thank you, Julian. Tim, did you want to say something?
Well, thanks, Taz, because this is something that's a bit close to my heart with the new instant proposal. So these questions are, very relevant, really. I mean, I think the SRPs have two roles. One is to facilitate coordination within SCAR between, the science groups, not to duplicate the science groups, but to add value to the science groups, or help the science groups add value maybe to the SRPs, but to facilitate and coordinate. And I hope that's something that we're getting close to, and we'll talk about tomorrow with the instant program. So the instant program, the very first question, Taz, was about integration between the SRPs. How do we do that? And one of the ways you can do that is look at an overarching big question that requires a multidisciplinary approach. And I guess what we've come up with instant, and this was a convergence really from a number of SRPs that were all interested in how the Antarctic ice sheet was changing is in response to climate change, but specifically what that was doing to the ice sheet and contributing to sea level rise. So that's brought together, elements of CERSI, AntClim, and PACE. I think the other thing that an SRP should be very cognizant of is what's going on in the broader ecosystem outside of SCAR. And I think, a really important role is forming partnerships, strategic partnerships with WCRP where you can complement and benefit and for each other. And I think Tom showed some nice examples how AntClim, I'm going to say now, but 21, have done that in the past. And so it's not duplication, it's partnership and I think facilitation. And I think that is the role of an SRP, where a group within SCAR is a lot more focused on a specific set of issues.
Thanks, Tim. That's a really wise set of words and really timely. Speaking of time, I'd much rather continue this discussion. We're just getting fired up, I think, but as a good convener now, I'll observe the time limit and say thank you to everybody. Thanks to the 253 participants I see on Zoom. I hope it's been a worthwhile, if somewhat poorer substitute for seeing you all here in Hobart. Good night from Hobart. Good day to everyone. Bye.